Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's installment of ClueCon Weekly. This week with us, we have Jim Dalton, CEO of TransNexus, who has a wealth of knowledge about the entire telephony industry, especially regarding security, fraud, and identity. So, Jim, you'd like to introduce yourself quickly, please? And welcome.
Yeah. Hey, well, Luca, first I want to say I really appreciate that opportunity to speak with you. You know, it's so cool what the Signal Wire people are doing. I mean, what y'all are enabling. I mean, going back from the very beginning of Free Switch, it's a great legacy of enabling so much positive disruption and creation in the telephone industry. And having been around a while, I've gotten to witness that. And I just want to say it's really exciting, you know, what you guys have done. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Just a little bit of background about me. Been in the software business since '97. We got started focusing on really selling routing and policy engines for voice over IP networks. And that's always what we've done. That's our focus. We sell a platform that complements session border controllers and soft switches. And so that's all about me.
Oh, yeah, that's been a long time. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of things happen in the industry, which leads me into the first thing I'd like to ask you about. You're an expert on stir shaken, which seems to be something that's simultaneously very important to the industry and not very well understood by a lot of players. So I'd like to ask you all about stir shaken, which is probably not going to be enough time, but at least an introduction to the topic. And why is it so important for the industry?
Yeah. Hey, well, Luca, yeah, happy to talk about it. You know, I'll just speak briefly on the technology. I'm sure your audience probably understands it completely. But it's really just this simple. It's adding a new identity header to SIP messages. So this new header called the identity header. And in it, it has a passport token, basically a JSON token that has been digitally signed. You know, that's nothing new. That's no big deal. I mean, you know, your audience understands that. But what really makes it powerful is it's anchored by a policy administrator that's been appointed by the numbering authority of whatever country you look at. Now, right now, they're just two. It's the US and Canada. Both have a policy administrator. And that really gives you a single source of a trust anchor. And the policy administrator does two things. First of all, it vets who can sign a telephone call. Can't just be anybody. Technically, anybody can do it, but it can only be an organization that's been allowed to join the Shaken Trust network. And it sounds like, wow, that's a hurdle by the existing telephone companies to keep out, you know, new entrants. Yeah. Not really. The hurdle is pretty low. The hurdle is it's very low. If you've got, I won't get into the details unless, you know, we want to get into that. But my point is, it's very open. And any service provider, any VoIP provider can absolutely join the Shaken Trust network. So you get vetted by the policy administrator. There is a fee, like anything with the government. There's a fee. It's not too onerous. It's not that expensive. Mm-hmm. And the other role of the policy administrator is they vet who can sell a Shaken certificate. Because when you go to sign a telephone call, sign the identity header, you can't just use any certificate. You can't use an SSL certificate. You can't use a code signing certificate. It has to be a Shaken certificate. So you have to get a Shaken certificate from a certificate authority that's been approved by the policy administrator. And the policy administrator distributes the root certificates of those approved Shaken certificate authorities. So what that does is it really gives you some accountability. You know, who can sign calls, who can provide certificates to sign calls. If anybody misbehaves, the policy administrator can immediately revoke their certificates, and they will if there is a problem. So it really brings oversight, accountability, and integrity to the entire voice security network.
That's really interesting. It sounds like it's how SSL certificates used to work. Like it used to be harder to get an SSL certificate for your web. It used to be some authorized issuers that could give you a master certificate you can then use to generate the website, let's call them like that, certificate. So now will be something. So that's the technical part. But I do have a question for the that will help the non-technical audience understand better. Ultimately, this provides a way to identify your callers. Is this kind of like a certified caller ID for people who are absolutely non-technical? How will you define this?
That's a great description. So it's not actually a certified caller ID, because all Shaken does is really sign the calling number. So you can be sure the calling number has not been spoofed in transit. So that's really what Shaken does. And the other thing is, who signed that call. So the originating service provider, they sign that call. You see right in the passport, the Shaken token, who signed it, the public certificate to validate the token, to validate the signature. So that's really kind of the integrity piece. You know where that call came from. And there's actually a little bit more I need to get into. Well, I said it's not, verified caller identity. You can add that. And this is an IETF standard that really embellishes what can be in a Shaken passport is rich call data. And you can put the name of the calling party in there. You can put a URI for the logo, the picture of the calling party, the reason the calling party is calling. And all of that is signed.
Oh, wow.
And so now you get a phone call, and, you get it on your handset, and, I can say, this is Luca, he's calling, and whatever, why you're calling, I know it's you. That is powerful for the people in the Signal Wire community are trying to complete calls for their customers. Their call answer rates are going to go up dramatically, because the consumer's going to know, oh, I know who's calling, I know why, I'm going to answer that call. That's really what matters for Shaken, why it's important to users.
Yeah, Luca's company is calling me about the contract renewal. So I know the call is actually from my company, and I'm calling about the contract. You have a contract with me, so you pick up. You don't have to worry with, is it true? And are they trying to scam me, etc.? So it's more than just caller ID. It's true. It's security about being certain who's on the other end of the phone, which is, I think, is very, very very, very important. So one thing I'd like to ask you, does this affect the existing regulations in any way? Is there anything about the FCC regulations that's going to change around the identity of callers given the stir Shaken? How long is it going to take before the market really has this in bulk? So where are we going?
Yeah, Luca, it's really fascinating. I'll just step back. Congress passed a law at the end of 2019 and said, if you have a SIP interconnect, you have to implement stir and Shaken. I mean, it's a law. You've got to do that. And you have a year and a half to do it. So starting June 30th, all SIP calls need to be signed, have this Shaken passport included in the SIP invite that's sent out from a network. But let me just a couple of things for your audience to understand. The FCC did give you kind of a loophole if you're a small carrier. If you have fewer than 100,000 subscribers, you can put off your implementation for 2 years. So you don't have to implement Shaken right away, which for the Signal Wire community, you're going to implement Shaken because it's a value add. But if you're a little telephone company in the middle of nowhere, all you know is TDM, it's a real challenge. So they gave you that loophole. Not that it really matters. But in addition, with that loophole, they said everybody has to file, and this, everybody needs to listen closely to this. It applies to everyone. They really broaden the net of who this regulation applies to. Anybody who originates telephone calls for their customers. It doesn't matter if you're a non-interconnected VoIP provider or not. If it looks like a telephone call, sounds like one, and you're putting it on the network, then if you don't do Shaken, you need to do robocall mitigation. And actually, if you do Shaken, you need to perform robocall mitigation. And let me one last thing before I finish, and then I'll let you ask some questions. Here's the kicker: you have to file your robocall mitigation plan with the FCC starting in. They're going to make this database available after March 31st. They haven't given the exact date. They just said it won't be before March 31st, and it will definitely have to be. You have to submit by June 30th. And get a load of this. This is harsh. 90 days after June 30th, if you are not in that database, then intermediate carriers are required to block your calls, all calls.
So come September, it will be quite a mess in the industry, I would say.
That's crazy. Yeah, literally October. October 1st, if you look like a telephone service provider and then you're intermediate, unless they're saying this is an enterprise customer, and we know this customer, and we can give him an attestation of A because we know this customer. If your wholesale provider will do that, you're fine. But if they say no, we're just an intermediary, we don't know who these people are, we can't sign these telephone numbers because we don't trust them, then they're gonna have to block your calls. And that's people that came out. That second order came out just last fall, and people are still just trying to to get used to the idea. So it's there's a lot coming very soon in June that'll impact anybody that makes a telephone call and puts it on the public switch telephone network that appears to be an originating service provider. So let me stop there. That's a lot of words, but let me stop there.
I do have a couple questions. So first of all, what is robocall mitigation plan that you mentioned? Like, I be honest, I don't know what that is from myself.
Yeah, nobody does. New term. We've always been talking about robocall prevention. I want to stop robocalls from entering my network. They're driving me crazy. I want to flag them as spam. I want to block them. That's robocall prevention. The FCC, they said, we're not interested in that. We want robocall mitigation. We want the originating service provider to monitor his traffic, know his customer, his or hers, know their customers, and prevent robocalls from originating on their network. That's robocall mitigation. And so you've got to make sure, that no robocalls, you don't originate any robocalls.
So they're putting a banking style know your customer requirement on service providers effectively.
Yes, that's you've got it right. That came from the banking industry. Know your customer.
Yeah,
exactly.
it's a very similar thing. So right now you won't be able to say anymore, look, I'm just selling trunks. I don't care. I don't know what people are doing with my trunks. You're not able to say that anymore. Wow,
right.
That's I wonder if that is not a topic for this conversation, probably, but I wonder if that has ramifications on the internet in general. Like that might be a loophole that starts the various YouTube and other video sharing companies will have to start worrying, because that might be a precedent. But I mean, it's neither here nor there. Still, in the context of our industry, it still sounds like our carrier team is going to have a lot of work come. Well, not June, come now, because they are already working on the STIR-shaken implementation and the related knowledge. So I would really like to ask something for the so we've been trying to go a bit more into the business oriented topics, so people get a bit more usefulness out of these conversations. From a pure non-technical standpoint, what is a robocall? And that will fall under this aspect, because I feel like there's many. So I know that, for example, if you initiate the call by dialing a number, that's not considered a robocall. That's a person making a phone call. They can be still annoying, but they're not a robocall. There's also call centers that are able to initiate outbound calls, but that are not doing predictive dialing or blanket dialing. They're just calling one number. So I am sitting in front of my computer, your name comes up, I click a button, and that call gets placed to your phone. And if you answer, that's technically a automatically initiated call. So I didn't type the number, but it's probably not a robocall. So what constitutes a robocall, and how can our customers make sure they're not really making trouble by setting up something?
Yeah, that's a really good question. To answer that, the simple answer is this: as long as you comply with the Telecommunications Consumer Protection Act, TCPA, compliant, then even if it's an annoying phone call, and the classic example are debt collectors, they have the right to make those phone calls. They're not robocalls. So there are a lot of different rules at the federal level, the Federal Trade Communications level, and at the state level that defines what is a valid call. So if you apply to those, if you comply with those rules, even if it's considered a robocall, you're not going to get in trouble with the feds. And those compliance rules are more complex than I can describe, and and I understand. It's a whole different area of telecom I'm not that familiar with.
Yeah.
But it's really that simple. If you're TCPA compliant, somebody complains, you show the feds, look, we're TCPA compliant, and say you're right. And I think you're going to be okay.
I'm wondering, could we just make a quick example of some call that will always be considered a robocall or something? Will it be something like impersonating another company, for example? Would that always be considered fraud? Like if I called you with a recorded message from Bank of America and I'm not Bank of America, would that be considered certainly a problematic call? Is it more nuanced? Can we even make an example, which sounds like it might be able not to?
Oh, these things really are for the lawyers to answer. But if somebody complains and multiple people can complain, you're in
Yeah.
trouble. What this It's all about enforcement, and
Okay.
what the technology and what the regulations give is they really give the feds a sledgehammer to go after bad actors. It's
Oh,
been
wow.
awfully hard to do anything in today's world because tracing back a call, it's difficult, it's time consuming. With shaking, it becomes much simpler, and the rules give the enforcement authorities the language they need to go after people that are causing trouble.
Yeah, sounds like from a certain perspective, we're moving towards something that will be similar, not quite, but broadly similar to what we're seeing in the messaging market, where the advent of campaign registries and 10 DLC campaigns effectively make you, first of all, you have to sort of pre-approve your content. Otherwise, the carriers will just not let you through. And also there's rules about what you can put in messages, how you communicate, etc. It's going to be similar. As you're saying, it's all about enforcement, but there are certainly ways you can, well, you certainly stay within the law, of course, but staying within the law looks like it's only part of it. The other part is having campaigns that are built to not annoy people, because your problems start when someone complains.
That's true. Yeah.
So
So
it's almost psychological. Like it's not, there's no clear cut case where you can just say, hey, look, if you do this, they're not gonna have trouble. Same thing goes with messaging, really, because even if you have your so our broad guidelines say always have a personal address message. Keep the conversation has to be directed to the person. So if you're sending a reminder, make sure to say, hey Jim, you have an appointment for tomorrow at 10 a.m. Always have opt-out language, etc. That's often not enough, because at that point you start hitting again, if someone complains, you still have trouble.
right. Yeah.
So I think it's about not getting complained at, essentially, more than anything.
Yes, I agree. I think you're right. That's right. You won't show up on the FCC's radar or the FTC's radar if there are no complaints.
So having Stir shaken into the mix, is this going to make it harder for smaller companies to operate in the field, or do you think that's actually helping smaller players? Because it's not like you need a whole lot of infrastructure and certificates and getting up to speed. And I know a lot of small companies would do their honest work and get great revenue that may be run by 5 people. Is it making things harder or not really?
I tell you, for the signal wire audience, the technology aspect is pretty trivial, and
Hmm.
I think that's good because the way the kind of the infrastructure, security infrastructure we talked about is opened up. I mean, it's open. Anybody can
Hmm.
join if they go through the regulatory hurdles are low, and they want to. I mean, it's designed to bring everybody in to be part of this trust network, and the big guys are terrible at innovation. And the little guys can get there so quickly. And we talked earlier about the rich call data. When
Yeah.
you can go in with APIs, go to an enterprise and say, I can have it, set up to your campaign. Every time you make a call, you're going to be able to change on a per call basis the call reason, the logo, the picture, who's calling, whatever it might be, dynamically. And I'm going to sign those calls for you and they're going to get delivered. It will be years before the big guys do that. And so I think the ability to really to provide that trust for
Hmm.
telephone calls, and then we think it'll be extended beyond telephone calls. That's a big value add. And I think for smaller operators who are more nimble, it's a great opportunity.
Oh, it's actually better, yeah, because you're able to move faster.
Yes.
Convincing an entire carrier which has 10,000 employees to move to something is always a hurdle. We can see how IMS adoption went. IMS has been out there for a good part of what, 30 years now? and it's still sort of not there. So it's yeah, it is. I mean, IMS is ubiquitous at this point, but not quite really. Not everybody is on IMS at this point.
Yes.
It's quite interesting. So you mentioned something that sounds very interesting. You say the stir shaken, at least in concept, might extend to other communication methods. Like, as you know, SignalWire has video offerings. We do messaging. We do a lot of stuff. You think stir shaken could be the start of a general identity change in communications?
I don't see why it wouldn't be. I mean, for any SIP communication, for sure, why wouldn't it be the case? And I don't think anyone disagrees with that. That's off in the future. Right now, we're just trying to get Shaken to work for SIP voice calls. But certainly for any SIP transaction, that could be the case. And it's just a passport, a digitally signed passport, a JSON token that could be included in any kind of signaling. So yeah, I don't see why it couldn't be extended to any kind of any kind of communication. And again, it brings that integrity and security to every communication transaction, which is it's a big value add. We think it'll
Oh,
happen.
really? Yeah, there's startups in the RTC space that have been doing online verification for, especially in Europe. Europe has a lot of interesting. There are actually important regulations, but they're very complicated that require, for example, a bank to perform identification of the party on the other side with complex methods such as showing an ID document in front of the camera. A person at a bank employee has to sign off that, yeah, I am the bank employee. I'm saying that indeed you are Jim Dalton, because the pandemic, etc. You cannot just go to the bank in person anymore. So they had to change that. It sounds like this could be a great way to speed up that part of those interactions, because right now the whole industry in Europe, because of those regulations, is in a bit of, I wouldn't say turmoil, but everybody's trying to find a solution. Like, how do we figure out identification of a remote party in a video call, in a conference, without having to have them raise their document in front of the camera, which sounds like it's something from even not the 80s, like it's a 70s thing. Like,
Yeah, it is. And that's what this know your customer requirement is all about. I mean, the originating service provider, the expectation is they vet their subscribers and they collect that information. And so, everything that's going to be in your document, your address, whatever, that would be transmitted in a shaken passport. And so when you call the bank, they get that. And, they still need, they're going to go through their authentication procedures, but they know this has been signed by AT&T. They vetted this customer, and this is what they have. This is what they're signing.
So that saves time even for a customer calling into a company. This is not just for company to customer calls. It's also vice versa. You're right. If I had a stir shaken passport, I call Bank of America. I do have an account with Bank of America. I call Bank of America. They don't have to do quotes anything. They will still ask me a few questions, but
they're going to ask you questions. They have to.
It's far simpler and it's far more secure. And on their end, so I'm putting myself in the company's shoes. On their end, they're more certain of who I am, because ultimately, even the verification they do right now has no digital component. There's no certificates involved. There's no passport. They ask me a few questions, which honestly, for example, my wife probably knows all of the answers to. Which I love her, I trust her. I think it would never be any problem. But say someone else has a problem with their wife, she knows the answers to those questions. She has a male friend call into the bank and just give the answers, and that gets ugly very quickly. And it's happened. You read about that in the news every day. And so the password could really, really change that, because even if they still ask you the questions, they still have the underlying thing where, hey, this number is not Luca's number. This is not signed by Luca. This doesn't say Luca on the passport.
That's a very good point. Yeah, it does help with that. If somebody steals your phone, you got a problem. But so the bank still will need to go through its authentication procedures, but it's definitely a big help. You're right. They can't be just somebody calling from any telephone. Good point.
And if you have, somewhat modern habits in security, so you have your phone have either Face ID or your fingerprint I think stealing your phone is probably not going to work, because really it's right now. I honestly, I haven't heard of anybody who got their phone stolen and used in years at this point.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. So just, it's there's no one single solution, but every measure of security you have to pile it on. And I think passports will help a lot.
Well, it really makes the phone number secure, which right now is sort of the weak link in an interaction like the one we described, because they can still ask you for your favorite food. That's your secret answer. They can still ask you for the address where you lived when you were 12 and stuff like that. But ultimately, the phone number could be anyone.
Exactly. Yeah.
It is very interesting. Yeah, I think we have something on our hands here, and SignalWire is working hard to provide those that infrastructure and the necessary stir shake and stuff to people. Also, because we are a provider, and as a result, we do need to address that. And we are way past the 100,000 subscribers, so we really need to address that. Yeah, I think the industry. So you think stir shaking is really that important to the industry? Earlier, when we were setting up the call, you mentioned that stir shaking could be more important than SIP, or at least as important as SIP for the industry. You think that's really the case?
I wouldn't say it's more important than SIP, but I think it's the biggest change in terms of voice communication since SIP. Yeah, I think the impacts are going to be really large, because once the innovators get a hold of this, now we've got this trusted identity. What can I do with it using rich call data added to, the passport and it's signed? I think there are going to be applications that come out of the woodwork that, we just never thought of. And it's going to create a lot of new call situations, which I think will be really positive. Again, it's going to be the little operators who take advantage of that, not the dinosaurs. So I think it's a good thing for smaller companies. Absolutely.
And SignalWire is going to be there. We try to move fast, and it's how we're gonna. I think we have a solid plan in place, and we'll reveal that soon, because honestly, we got a month to go, so it has to be out there. We already published some papers, etc., but we'll have to go and finish it. Well, thank you very much, Jim. It was a great chat, and I think we got a lot of value out of it, both for our more technical people and the more business-oriented people who are joining the podcast more and more, because it feels like we've been doing a good job on that area. That's why I try to ask both types of questions. So, well, thanks again, Jim Dalton, CEO of TransNexus, for joining us today, and thank you.
Great, Luca. Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Have a great day.